Midnight wrapped the city in wet neon as Ethan Cole stared at a buzzing phone on his kitchen counter. Rain pecked the window like a clock he could not stop. He pressed play. Thomas Cole said, "You were never enough." The words arrived, soft, surgical, final. The room drew smaller, while the fridge hummed a tired drone. Ethan's grip slipped, and a coffee mug nudged the edge like a dare. Thomas Cole said, "I hid your mother's letters." The truth detonated without smoke. Years of striving folded like paper in a sink. Ethan said, "Please say there's more," but the voicemail ended with a hospital beep and air. Streetlight bled amber across a pile of unpaid bills. His breath came shallow, then shallower. He set the phone face down, as if it were a live wire. Somewhere below, a siren threaded the rain and kept going. Inside, silence learned his name. Dawn arrived like a verdict, and Ethan met it with swollen eyes and a spine of glass. He replayed the message and counted breaths that never reached his belly. The toaster popped, and no one flinched. He remembered trophies packed into boxes, and the day he moved out with a handshake instead of a hug. Thomas Cole said, "I hid your mother's letters," and the word hid stained every memory he owned. Ethan rinsed the mug and watched the brown ribbon vanish. He felt a blueprint of himself dissolve at the edges. Ethan said, "What is left if the story was a lie?" The faucet sputtered and fell quiet. The apartment seemed to tilt, and he gripped the counter to stay in the day. Outside, taxis hissed over wet asphalt. Inside, a decision waited like a closed door. He walked the hallway as if the floor might argue. The voicemail hovered behind his ears, and every framed photo became a witness. He paused at a picture from graduation and searched the pixels for warmth. Thomas Cole said, "You were never enough," and the frame grew heavier in his hand. Ethan said, "I tried until my bones made noise," as he set it down like fragile glass. The air smelled of old dust and rain. A neighbor's radio bled a morning ad that promised certainty for a monthly fee. He closed his eyes and saw unopened letters as small white doors. Something in him wanted to run. Something older wanted stillness he did not trust. He chose shoes and keys and the stairwell with shaking breath. The street greeted him with hot coffee smells and the hard truth of Monday. Rain had thinned to mist, and neon signs forgot to sparkle. He kept walking until the city's noise became a blanket. A poster for a neighborhood zendo hung crooked on a lamppost. A quiet line read, "Sit and see what is true." Ethan read it twice. He considered how silence had only ever punished him. He weighed 6 words against 30 years. Ethan said, "I do not want to be alone with him," and meant the voice he carried. The mist kissed his hair, and he lifted his face to feel it. Somewhere, a bell from a bike drifted through. The world felt both cruel and inviting. Back upstairs, the apartment waited like a question mark. He placed the phone on the table and set the flyer beside it. The room did not change, but his posture did. He stood taller by a breath. Thomas Cole said, "I hid your mother's letters," and the words lost a little venom under the light. Ethan said, "I can look for myself," and the sentence surprised him with its weight. He opened a drawer and found a box of unsent notes to no one. The paper felt warm from old anger. He sealed the box again, not as surrender but as pause. Rain stopped. A sliver of sun tapped the window like a polite guest. The decision was not loud, but it was real. The zendo hid above a bakery, and warm bread met cool incense on the stairs. Ethan climbed with careful feet and a pulsing temple. A bronze bell waited by a shoe rack like a small sun. Grace Miller said, "Shoes off, phone off, heart open if possible." Ethan said, "I do not know how, but I can try." A clipboard took his name as if it had been saving a space. The room was cedar, quiet, and bright without glare. Cushions formed a patient constellation on the floor. A kettle whispered behind a paper screen. Ethan touched his ribs and counted 4 thin breaths. The voicemail's echo pressed at the door yet did not enter. Grace led him to a cushion and modeled posture with quiet bones. Grace Miller said, "Sit tall like a mountain and soft like mist." Ethan said, "My back is a complaint department." She smiled and adjusted his knees with 2 fingers. Grace Miller said, "Count the exhale to 4, then begin again." The clock did not tick, yet time moved like honey. A sparrow scolded the eve and fell silent. Ethan's shoulders lowered a notch he did not authorize. The breath was thin thread, but it held. He stared at the floor knot that resembled a closed eye. He felt the room agree to hold him without comment. First minute was a slow fall through cotton. The second minute was a trapdoor. Thomas Cole said, "You were never enough," and the words floated like hooks. Ethan said, "1," at the end of an exhale and lost it by 2. A heat rose behind his eyes without tears. Grace Miller said, "When you drift, return, no story needed." Ethan said, 2, and a grocery list crashed the gate. The cushion felt like stone teaching patience. A siren murmured, then faded into rain ghosts. Ethan said, 3, and found his jaw unclench for a breath. The room held steady as his thoughts tried to sprint. By minute 5, panic tested the locks. His chest felt smaller than a fist, and the room became a rumor. Grace Miller paused behind him without touching. Grace Miller said, "Label it fear, bow to it, return to breath." Ethan said, "Fear," in a voice meant for no one. The name took some teeth from the animal. He counted an exhale to 4, and landed like a feather on a ledge. His knees burned but did not threaten revolt. The bell on the altar waited without pity or promise. Ethan said, "Stay," and stayed. The world did not applaud, yet something unclenched where applause once lived. The bell finally bloomed and folded the sit like paper. Everyone bowed, and the room exhaled together. Ethan's legs tingled with pins that felt like weather. Grace poured tea that smelled like clean rain. Grace Miller said, "How was your first field test?" Ethan said loud inside, but not only loud. She set a small cod beside his cup. Grace Miller said, "Come again tomorrow, same storm, same anchor." The tea warmed more than his hands. He glanced at the door and did not flinch. The city could wait while he finished the last slow sip. The office hummed with fluorescent fatigue, while Ethan opened a slide deck his heart did not trust. Jason Reed said, "We need the numbers bigger," and the room agreed without blinking. Ethan counted 4 on the exhale and felt a seam in his chest hold. The graph blurred like rain on glass where no rain lived. His inner judge arrived with a briefcase and a smirk. Thomas Cole said, "You were never enough," and the cursor shook like a leaf. Ethan said, "One breath," beneath the clatter of keys. Karen Lewis said, "You have the lead, Ethan," and the table turned toward him. He named panic and watched it surrender a tooth. He spoke slowly and did not abandon himself. The meeting ended with nods that sounded like doors closing softly. He packed the laptop as if it were a fragile promise he intended to keep. He returned to the Zendo before rush hour carved the city into sharp pieces. The air smelled of cedar and patience. Grace Miller said, "What did the storm teach today?" Ethan said, "That it knows my name, but I can still sit." She adjusted his cushion like a compass. Grace Miller said, "When the hook appears, bow before you unhook." He closed his eyes and heard his breath braid with the room. The inner critic tried new costumes and failed the audition. He felt the back soften without surrender. Grace Miller said, "Unshakable is not hard, it is clear." He believed her for the length of 2 slow exhalations and began again. Wanurga. Halfway through the sit, memory slipped a hand through the door without knocking. A trophy shelf surfaced like a mirage of brass and dust. Thomas Cole said, "Second place is a beautiful failure," and the sentence pressed hard on his ribs. Ethan said, "Name it story, and let the reel keep spinning without purchase." A flicker of shame tried to bloom and met steady breath. He counted to 4, and felt the floor take his weight. Grace Miller said, "The mind will sell loud lies at a discount, and silence raised the price." He noticed the space between thoughts widen like dawn. He did not win anything, and still nothing was missing. The bell waited for no one and arrived right on time. Outside, the subway groaned like an animal learning patience. Ethan stood on the platform and tested his anchor against the crowd. A child cried, a busker tuned, a delay announced itself with authority. He named a noise and watched it lose its teeth. A man bumped his shoulder and kept moving. Ethan said, "4," and his breath drew a small circle of weather around his face. The train arrived as a wind and a mirror. He met his reflection and did not prosecute it. Grace Miller said, "Stand where your feet are," and he stood. The doors closed, and he traveled without leaving himself behind. Night gathered in his apartment with fewer sharp corners than before. He set a timer and sat on a folded blanket facing the window. The city pulsed like a distant heart he no longer feared. Thomas Cole said, "You were never enough," and the line arrived without a throne. Ethan said, "Fear," and bowed to it like weather. He counted to 4 and felt warmth in the belly find a door. The urge to check the phone lifted and passed. Grace Miller said, "Clarity repeats until it becomes character," and the room agreed. He ended the sit without triumph and with unmistakable ground. He washed a cup and left the sink clean, like a note to tomorrow. Morning leaned pale against the window, while Ethan emptied a drawer he had avoided for years. Receipts breathed dust and old breath. Thomas Cole said, "I hid your mother's letters," and the sentence tugged at the wood. A strip of tape surrendered a small brass key with a storage tag. Ethan said, "If not now, when?" and listened to the room answer with silence. A folded note in his father's tight script read, "For when you are steady." Steady felt like a word borrowed from strangers. He sat on the floor and let the key rest in his palm like weather. Memories rose in uninvited colors, and none asked to be true. Ethan said, "I will find her voice," and the vow rang warmer than his fear. Outside, the city coughed awake and kept moving. Inside, the next door appeared without a handle, and still he stood. Aunt Linda opened her door with cinnamon on the air and worry in her eyes. Linda Cole said, "You look like your mother when a decision starts." He held up the key and the note like a passport. She led him to a cedar box wrapped in string. Linda Cole said, "She wrote for the storms she could not hold." Ethan said, "He kept them from me," and the room tilted. Linda Cole said, "He kept you from drowning in them," and the floor steadied. The box weighed more than wood and paper should. A ribbon of grief unspooled without screaming. Ethan said, "I need to know what she knew." Linda nodded as if a ceremony had begun. The house settled like an old ship as he cut the string. The first letter smelled faintly of jasmine and years. Her handwriting curved like a shoreline he had forgotten. Margaret Cole said, "If you are reading this, your father did the hard thing." The line cut as it healed. She wrote of a stalker who found their address twice. She wrote of court dates and fear that ate sleep. Margaret Cole said, "Your father raised steel so you could grow soft." Ethan said, "He was a wall I mistook for a cage." The pages named birthdays she missed and recipes she folded into prayer. Shame crossed his face and left it softer. He closed the letter and felt the room change shape without moving. Truth arrived like weather, cruel and kind. He found Grace in the garden, where bamboo clicked like quiet clocks. Ethan said, "He saved me and still hurt me," and the words carried both heat and bow. Grace Miller said, "Two truths can sit on one cushion." Wind combed the leaves into a slow breath. Ethan said, "What do I do with the anger that remains?" Grace Miller said, "Name it gratitude's twin, and let them both eat." A sparrow argued with a cloud and lost politely. The bell sounded from inside as if answering no one. Ethan felt the ground receive his weight like news. Clarity and confusion held hands and refused to separate. He stood longer than comfort and did not break. The storage unit smelled like cold metal and old plans. A single bulb hummed as he opened a banker's box. Legal folders wore years like frost. He found a protective order with his name anchored in black. He found a photo of Thomas holding a toddler with careful pride. Ethan said, "You were a wall," and his voice did not accuse. A sealed envelope waited with his name, in the same tight script. Thomas Cole said, "I failed at gentleness, not love," in words dated 2 winters ago. Grief rose like tide and chose not to drown him. He bowed to the photograph and to the boy it held. The lock clicked closed, and something in him opened. The rain paused at dusk as Ethan stepped into the Zendo for the long sit. The hall felt wider than memory, as if the walls had learned to breathe. Grace Miller said, "Tonight we sit through the storm." Ethan said, "I am ready to fail and stay." She adjusted his cushion and tucked a blanket near his knees. Grace Miller said, "Count the exhale to 4 and bow to what arrives." The room settled into a hush that was not empty. Petal clicked off like a small moon, going down. Ethan said, "Fear and gratitude are twins," and his mouth surprised him. Grace Miller said, "Let both be welcome guests." The bell opened the hour with a note that climbed his spine. He closed his eyes and met the night with nothing but breath. 10 minutes in, the mind drew knives from old kitchens. Thomas Cole said, "You were never enough," and the sentence tried to buy his breath. Ethan said, "Label, shame," and watched heat rise without command. His knees sang a metallic hymn that did not ask permission. Grace Miller said, "Return without drama from somewhere beyond the body." Ethan said, 1, and the number was a rope that did not snap. A memory of spilled trophies turned to dust before it landed. He named anger, and it stopped pretending to be law. He named grief, and it stopped pretending to be weather. The room did not rescue him, it witnessed. He bowed inside the breath as if entering a temple with no doors. The inner judge arrived, wearing his father's careful silence. Thomas Cole said, "Stand up and be measured," and the air turned narrow. Ethan said, "I bow to the voice, and not the verdict." He let his chin dip the width of a breath. The floor received him like an oath that finally fit. Thomas Cole said, "Strength is armor," and the room heard the hinge. Ethan said, "Strength is clarity," and exhaled to 4. The face in his mind softened at the edges like fog, leaving a field. He touched the pain without hiring it as a guard. Grace Miller said, "Name it scene." And the hook lost its barb. The bell waited somewhere ahead, but the collapse had already become a door. The bell bloomed and the room unfolded like a held breath released. Ethan's legs burned, yet the fire felt like daylight. He bowed with the group and remained seated after the line thinned. Grace poured tea and set it near his hands. Grace Miller said, "What broke and what stayed?" Ethan said, "The story broke and the breath stayed." She nodded as if the floor had answered. Grace Miller said, "Make a small ritual and keep it honest." He placed his father's letter on the low table and touched the paper like a forehead to stone. Ethan said, "Thank you for the wall," and the words did not tremble. The night outside carried fewer sharp edges than before. He walked home under a sky rinsed clean by steady rain. Streetlights stitched a breadcrumb line across puddles. The phone stayed silent and heavy in his pocket. Ethan said, "Clarity repeats until it becomes character," and the words felt earned. He entered the apartment and left the lamp dark. The city pulsed beyond the glass like a tide on good terms with the moon. He sat for 10 more minutes without a timer. Thomas Cole said, "I failed at gentleness," and the sentence no longer asked for trial. Ethan said, "I choose gentle and firm," and the room agreed. He washed the cup and folded the towel with care. The night did not applaud, and confidence did not ask it to. Morning lifted the blinds and found Ethan already sitting. The kettle sighed, and the room smelled like cedar and paper. He set his father's letter beside a small cup and bowed. Grace Miller said, "Practice begins where comfort ends." He let the words settle like dust and counted 4 on the exhale. He wrote 3 lines to Thomas in a plain notebook. Ethan said, "I forgive the wall, and I forgive the wound." The sentence landed without thunder and did not need it. He folded the page and placed it under the cup like a vow. The city coughed awake beyond the glass, and he did not rush to meet it. He stood, straightened the tie, and left the lamp off. Confidence felt less like armor and more like a clean floor. The office smelled like coffee and deadlines that believed in themselves. Jason Reed said, "The client wants flash, not patience." Karen Lewis said, "We can still tell the truth." Ethan counted 4 and let his shoulders drop a notch. Ethan said, "We lead with the real numbers and show the path." Silence tested the table and found no weakness. Jason Reed said, "Will they buy that?" Ethan said, "We buy it first," and the room exhaled. He assigned tasks without apology and without heat. The deck grew cleaner as noise fell away. He closed the meeting with a bow. No one noticed. The inner judge knocked and left when no one answered. And Linda's kitchen warmed the afternoon with cinnamon and stock. Linda Cole said, "Your mother cooked this when storms parked overhead." Ethan set the letters on the counter like guests. Ethan said, "I want to taste what she meant by home." Linda Cole said, "Stir slow, and let the onions tell you when." The spoon traced circles that remembered patience. Steam fogged his glasses and cleared like weather. He read a paragraph aloud and felt the room lean closer. Margaret Cole said, "Soft is not weak, it is ready." He tasted and nodded, as if answering a bell. Linda Cole said, "You look steadier by degrees." He smiled without reaching for proof. The Zendo floor welcomed his knees and his broom. Grace Miller said, "Cleaning is prayer with a handle." Ethan said, "I want the ordinary to shine without applause." Dust lifted and settled like quiet birds. The bell on the altar kept its own weather. Grace Miller said, "Confidence is a relationship with attention." He pushed the broom in slow lines that did not try to impress. The room grew simple and wide. Ethan said, "I can come early on Wednesdays," and meant it. Grace Miller said, "Be the rhythm, not the rumor." He bowed to the empty cushions as if they were elders. Night gathered as a friend rather than a test. He walked to the river where the city kept its second face. Wind pressed his shirt and then let it go. Ethan said, "Thank you for the wall," and the water held the words without comment. He tore the copied letter into small white boats and let them drift. Grace Miller said, "Release is not erasing, it is right-sizing." He counted 4 and watched the paper find its level. A siren passed like weather and did not take him. He turned back toward lights that felt less like judgment and more like maps. The breath stayed close and steady. The client boardroom glittered with glass and impatience. Jason Reed said, "You take the room," and stepped aside. Ethan counted 4 on the exhale and let his shoulders lower. Karen Lewis said, "Led with the truth, not the fireworks." Ethan said, "Here's the real path and the risks we will own." The projector hummed like a calm engine. Charts looked less like judgment and more like maps. A question came sharp and fast, and he named his fear, then answered. He did not sell certainty, he offered clarity with steps. The room shifted from suspicion to attention. Jason Reed said, "That landed," and did not hide his relief. Ethan closed the laptop as if setting down a worn stone and bowed inside the breath. The cemetery was bright and wind-stitched, not grim. Aunt Linda walked beside him with a small thermos of tea. Ethan said, "I blamed the wall because it did not hug back." Linda Cole said, "It held until you could stand." He set a copy of the letter near the stone and knelt. Margaret Cole said, "Soft is ready," from the curve of her script. Ethan said, "I forgive the wall and the wound," and the grass agreed. He poured a little tea to the earth and waited. The wind lifted the paper and set it down again like a nod. Linda Cole said, "You can let him be human now." Ethan touched the name and felt anger and gratitude share a chair without fighting. The Zendo gathered in quiet like rain deciding to fall. Grace Miller said, "Tonight you ring," and placed the striker in his hand. Ethan said, "I will keep time, not chase it." The hall brightened without adding light. The first note rose and settled along the cedar like breath on skin. Grace Miller said, "Clarity is service, not spotlight." He walked the aisle with measured steps that did not negotiate. The inner judge came late and found no seat. Ethan said, "Seen and released," and bowed to the altar. The group leaned into silence as if it were a friend. The bell closed the sit and opened a door that required no keys. In the hallway outside a small auditorium, a junior analyst shook like a leaf. Maya Brooks said, "I cannot breathe enough to speak." Ethan said, "Stand where your feet are and count the exhale to 4. She copied his posture like a borrowed coat. Maya Brooks said 1, and her voice stopped breaking. Ethan said 2, and the air made more room. The door buzzed with waiting voices that did not own her breath. Maya Brooks said 3, and met his eyes. Ethan said 4, and begin again. The timer on his watch did not matter. Maya Brooks said, "I can do this," and walked in steady. Dawn found his apartment clear and quiet as a held note. He set the phone on the table and did not press play. The window carried a pale river of light across the floor. Ethan said, "I will practice today and tomorrow if I wake," and smiled. The kettle whispered and then fell silent. He bowed to the cup, the letter, and the breath that stayed. The city stirred like a friendly animal learning new tricks. Grace Miller said, "Keep the rituals small and honest in memory," and he agreed. He wrote a single line on a clean page and let the pen rest. He stood taller by a breath and faced the day without armor or apology. Confidence is the breath you choose when fear knocks.